Well, my clock on my computer says 7:01, and I like to be respectful of everyone's time. So I would like to begin the meeting. Oh, okay. I I would ask that you make sure that you're muted. Okay. Okay. And I have a few announcements before I introduce our speaker. The first one is that our community service project for December will be working with the nurses of School District 7. They have emergencies throughout the year where kids need glasses, our clothing, our gym shoes, that kind of thing. And they need some help in having funds to meet some of those expenses. So that's what we will be doing. We are accepting donations, and you could do that by mailing a check to our pardon me, our post office box, which is 841. Our contact Carol Gert, our Carol Geip. I think Carol Gert will be accepting checks, and I believe Carol Geip also offered to come pick up checks if you would like. Okay. I also like to highlight our membership meeting, which is December 9th, and it will be in person, and it will be at St. John's United Methodist Church from 7 to 9. We will have refreshments, and they will be similar to what we did at our August meeting out at Township Park. The refreshments will be packaged, so everyone should feel comfortable choosing refreshments. And I was just out at the church today, and masks are recommended at this point. They were required, but now they're recommended. So put that on your calendar, and you'll receive more information about that in the next week or so. I also like to remind board members who are attending this meeting to please stay on Zoom after the meeting concludes, because we will need to talk about arrangements for our December meeting. Okay. I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. His name is Mike Boline. He's chairman of the City of Edwardsville Plan Commission and also works with the Edwardsville Community Housing Alliance. He has bachelor's and master's degrees in geography and is a member of the American Planning Association. So thank you, Mike, for giving us some of your time tonight.
Well, Carol, thank you for that introduction. I'm certainly excited to be here, so thank you for inviting me. Please just bear with me just a minute. I'm gonna get my screens all set up. Let's see. And let me know if you can see that on your end.
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, so this evening I'll be talking about zoning. So I'll be giving an overview. We'll be talking about the history of zoning, some of the basics of zoning, and then at the end I'll be talking about a couple examples of how zoning can impact affordability of housing. And zoning certainly impacts a lot of different things, but affordability is one of the one of my I guess pet projects at the city plan commission. It's one of the things I really am passionate about. This is the first time I've ever given this presentation, so I really welcome any feedback that you can give me to improve it for next time. And I'll be taking questions at the end, but I really like to keep these kind of things open. So feel free to interject if you have any questions during the presentation. And are you able to see my notes, or do you just see like the title slide?
We're just seeing the title slide.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm showing the right thing. Thank you. All right, so we'll get started with the history of zoning in the U.S. So that the first zoning ordinance occurred in 1885 in Modesto, California. So this is the first time that land use was restricted. And what it did was restrict wash houses to the poorer side of the city. So there's a lot of discussion in the past couple of years about the place of zoning and whether zoning is inherently discriminatory or inherently racist. And I'll touch upon that towards the end of the presentation, but certainly zoning laws did not get off to a great start because wash houses at that time in Modesto were almost all run by Chinese immigrants. And so this was really a discriminatory law put in place by the more affluent residents of Modesto. From there, other cities had been passing, one-off zoning ordinances here and there, but 1916 is when the first comprehensive zoning ordinance was passed in New York City. And so when I say comprehensive, I mean that they took out the map and zoned every single parcel and drew zones throughout all 5 boroughs. And this was really driven by a need to control skyscrapers, or at least a perceived need to control skyscrapers. But they also introduced land use designations. They introduced restrictions. One example was they wanted to keep hog lots away from the public right of way because they were seen as nuisances. So they baked in some of these style restrictions into the comprehensive zoning ordinance. And then throughout the 1920s, cities all over the US started to follow New York's model and pass their own zoning ordinances. And this led up to 1926, where there was a case, the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The village, they passed a comprehensive zoning ordinance, and Ambler felt that a lot of their realty holdings had lost a significant amount of value by the restrictions of land use. So they sued Euclid. And
bed too.
I'm sorry?
Like you're about ready for bed too.
Yeah, pretty close.
Oh, hey, Carol, you need to mute yourself.
And that set the precedent for local government's authority to set zoning laws. So that really established the police power that municipalities and counties have to set zoning ordinances up. Now, this is just the basic definition of zoning. So, people who are very civically minded may already have a good idea of the basics of what zoning is, but I just wanted to touch upon it. The APA has this definition, and that's the professional group for city and urban planners. And they define zoning as the division of a city or county by legislative regulations into areas or zones which specify allowable uses for real property and size restrictions for buildings within those areas. So there's really 2 things that zoning does. One is it restricts land use within the zone, and it also sets other restrictions. In this definition, they use size restrictions, but really there's a whole host of other restrictions within zoning ordinances. On the screen now, I have a map of the city of Edwardsville's zones. And I'm going to be using the city of Edwardsville for almost all of my examples. I realize that this is the Edwardsville area, so not all of you, you might not all live within the city, but this is a really good example of what a zoning map looks like. And some of you may be familiar with this map, but this is taken from our comprehensive plan back in 2010. It has 5 different districts. We have our central business district, which is in the heart of downtown Edwardsville. Here's Main Street in Vandalia. Hopefully you see my mouse pointer on the screen right now. And then through the corridors that exit town, so 157, 159, 143, or Marine Road, that's where we typically see our B2, which is our more general commercial district. One of the big things you'll notice is that the majority of our land area is taken up by R1, which is single family residential. And that's something that we're going to revisit later, but that's just an important thing to note. And Edwardsville is certainly not unique in this fact. Most communities are covered by R1, but we're certainly part of that mold. Then you have the R2 districts scattered throughout. We have manufacturing down in the American bottom, but also kind of, in different pockets throughout the community. You see SIUE is hatched out and it's listed as an institutional district. Really, we don't have any ordinances governing this institutional district. Since it's a state entity, the city of Edwardsville has no zoning authority over SIUE. So it's really just kind of hatched out because we don't really cover that at all. One thing I will point out, we have this on the screen, is this was from 2010, and this has certainly changed over time. We have a new zoning map. It's not very easily presentable on a screen, but we have lost some R2. There's pockets like right here. This is behind CVS at Park and what is that? Park and Fillmore. That neighborhood back there, that is now R1. North Kansas, some of this has been rezoned to R1 within recent years. So this is certainly a fluid map. It's certainly not static. And we've also increased our zones over time. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we've broken out our downtown business district. This was finalized a couple years ago. So now we have subzones within that district, and it's really a matter of changing densities. The central Main Street is where we have buildings right up on the right of way, right up on the sidewalk, and you're not required to have any setbacks on the side. So you have buildings, abutting right up to each other, and then the density and the setbacks decrease as you get out past Main Street into the mid downtown district and the downtown transition district. So they all have different regulations and restrictions within them. We have a new downtown mixed use. This was written into our zoning ordinance about a year ago. And this is really a trend in zoning throughout the country. The intent originally for zoning was to really separate out land uses, to separate residential from commercial, and certainly residential from industrial. And we see that, if you look at our downtown in Edwardsville, we have businesses on the main floor with residential above, and that's generally viewed as a desirable style of development. But up until last year, we did not allow that within our zoning ordinance. So now we do allow it. We allow it in some of the corridors going into the downtown. Do we have a question?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I
Well,
have a question. This is Susan.
Yeah.
So I don't, is that okay? Oof. Is that me? When you say this downtown mixed use wasn't done until a year ago, some of those areas with that kind of definition were developed before that. How did they get through your zoning process without having a specific designation for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the downtown areas, they were initially developed. I don't what the zoning ordinance looked like back then, or even if we had a zoning ordinance at that time. So as zoning laws change, anything that exists is grandfathered in and would become non-conforming. And so right now downtown it's not labeled mixed use, but it is a mixed use district now. And so I would assume that a lot of those buildings that were there were considered non-conforming uses. So they were allowed just from being grandfathered in. But there were certainly times where some of those buildings would not have been permitted.
So none of the new development with the businesses on the bottom, none of those were in the considered downtown mixed area? I'm thinking over by Chavez in particular, and that's not considered downtown.
Over by Chavez.
Yeah, those are apartments above those, so.
Oh, no, yeah, you're right. So I know that this mixed use downtown is brand new. That's about a year old. I think that our downtown business district had incorporated some mixed use before that. So if I misstated that, I apologize. But this specific downtown mixed use, it was instituted about a year ago. The B1 area where Chavez is, that would probably fall into their downtown business district, and that would have some level of mixed use allowed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I don't know the timeline on when mixed use would have been, reinstituted in our downtown district. And then we also have a conservation zone, and that's, the new Darda Woods and the watershed, those would fall under conservation. We also have a I-55 corridor, which is broken up into 3 zones, and that's all out obviously by I-55. And we haven't seen a lot of new development yet, but that's really intended to be more walkable, more dense, mixed use district over there. So when we had the definition up, I stated that really there are 2 pieces to zoning. There's the land use part of it, and then there's the restriction part of it. And so I want to give a few examples of that. The land use can really be broken down into 2 categories. There's permitted use and special use. And permitted use sounds just like what it is. It's what is permissible by right within that zone. So within R1, you're permitted by right to build a single family home. There's no special requirements for that. Special use is uses that would be complementary to that zone, but you would need to go through an approval process. This gives our city administrator a greater level of control. It also allows city council to weigh in. So I have a few examples using R1. So within R1 in Edwardsville, you are allowed to have a single family detached dwelling. Parks are permitted by right, as well as accessory uses. So that would be a garage or like a woodshed. Everything else is either not allowed or you need a special use permit. And here's a few examples of what's allowed by special use. We have schools, places of worship. Those are generally seen as complementary to residential areas. We have golf courses, which strangely enough, we do not allow par 3 golf courses. I'm not a golfer, but I find that one quite strange. Food pantries, things like that. Everything else is not allowed, even with a special use permit. So if you wanted to put a business in an area that is currently zoned R1, you would need to go through request a rezoning in order to accomplish that. Nested zoning is a concept I'll talk briefly about. So here's just an example of a few different districts or zones that a city might have. And single family residential is considered the most restrictive. And then it steps down, and industrial is considered the least restrictive zone. And so within the industrial zone, you're obviously allowed industrial use, but you're allowed any other use that is in a less restricted zone. So in industrial, you can have anything. In commercial, you are allowed a business or commercial, multifamily, or single family, and then it steps up. Sometimes this is called nested zoning. I've seen it called step down zoning or Euclidean 2 zoning. Really, the important thing here is that in the city of Edwardsville, we do not allow this. Many municipalities do allow it, but we are unique in that we do not. And this has come up on a few occasions and has complicated certain things for the city. One example is that within multifamily residential, you are not allowed by right to have a single family home. And a lot of our multifamily residential is kind of nested within single family zones. So if you were to try to acquire a mortgage for a single family home within this multifamily residential, a lot of times, banks hold up that sale. Really, I'm going down a tangent, but it does create some complication, but it is considered more restrictive when you do it that way. So we have a more restrictive zoning ordinance because we do not allow nested zoning. Now, the second part of zoning, the first aspect of it, like we discussed, was land use. The second is all the restrictions that come along with land use. And part of that APA definition was the size restrictions, and that's certainly part of it. We have lot size restrictions, building size restrictions. Sometimes that's a percentage of the lot. We have our setbacks, but we also have, in addition to size requirements, there's parking, building materials, architecture, and that's just a small piece of the picture. I have the City of Edwardsville Land Development Code and zoning ordinance in my hand right now. I don't know if you can see it, but if I flip over into the zoning code, we have, I think, 10 zones within the City of Edwardsville, and we have 242 pages that govern those zoning districts. So there are many restrictions, more than I could talk about in half an hour, that really make restrict what a landowner can do on their property. Now, I like this diagram. It shows the buildable area. So it shows the setbacks from the front, the setbacks from the side, pitch requirements, height requirements, and it shows the buildable area for a home within just a generic R1 zoning district. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about what is known as Euclidean zoning, and that refers to that case that went to the Supreme Court, Euclid versus Ambler, where it's really a approach that focuses on land use first and then form second. And that is the style of zoning that Edwardsville uses. That is the most preferred form of zoning. The second most popular form is form-based zoning. And this is an approach that focuses on form over land use. So the local government sets the form, and then the market really determines the mix of uses. So this would be just an example of what 6 zones would be in a form-based zoning. So you have your urban core, and then it gets less dense all the way down to a natural zone. So in your urban core, you would allow taller height restrictions, larger buildings, smaller setbacks, and you would find, the market would just fill in office space, larger apartments, things like that. In a suburban zone, the market would probably fill that with mostly single family homes. And then in the middle, you'd probably have a healthy mix of commercial and residential. But you wouldn't be separating those two things out. You could have a house, a business, then a house, kind of all mixed together. Now, another form of zoning, and this is a form that we see quite a bit in Edwardsville, and it can be somewhat controversial, are planned unit developments. So I have the definition on the screen. But a planned unit development is where a developer who has an idea for a development that might not fit in with our strict zoning ordinance. And so what they can do is apply for a planned unit development, and that basically invites the city into the planning process and allows us to spot zone that property to fit their development needs. So there's a few examples. If you look around town, the Edwardsville Town Center, which is now known as the Parkway, that was a PUD. This was zoned, I believe it was zoned B, or I think it was B2, General Commercial District. So you would not allow an apartment on a B2 lot, but the developer, which was Plocker Construction, they had this vision for a development that had a large apartment complex in the middle, surrounded by commercial uses, shops, dining, that the residences could walk to. And essentially their view was that this would be a net positive for the city. It does not strictly conform to our zoning ordinance, but it's within the spirit of what we're trying to do as a city. So they approach the city, and it sets off a long series of meetings. We are invited into their planning process, both the plan commission, the planning department, the city council, and we make suggestions. We discuss material, the look and feel of the buildings, layout, things like that. And then ultimately it would have to be approved by city council. So this is one that was approved by city council. They're still putting in new buildings out there as we speak. Another PUD was Whispering Heights along 157. Again, there were a handful of zoning ordinances that they were not going to be able to meet with this development, but this is also mixed use, which was not allowed. This was zoned B2 as well. This is a PUD that is currently mid-process. We discussed this at our plan commission meeting a couple days ago on Monday. It's what's known as City Walk. And let me zoom in a little bit. So this, just to orient everyone, this is South Kansas Street. This is East Schwarz Street. So the old BP would be up here, which is now called the Edwardsville Bank. And the BP's over here. Annie's is up here. And this is what is known as a pocket community. This is being developed by Fund Construction. And what we have are smaller homes. They're not what would be considered tiny homes, but they are smaller than our allowable footprint. And there's multiple on a lot. They do not conform to our setback requirements. So there's a lot of things that our zoning code would not allow this. They're all centered on a courtyard. They share parking that in these two parking lots that are off to the side. So they applied for a PUD, and we had 3 separate meetings at Plan Commission where we discussed this and worked with the developer and made recommendations. Here is what the buildings would look like, or will look like, depending on how city council votes on it. So this is now being handed off to the committees of city council. So this will likely be on their agenda within the next couple months. All right. So I kind of already touched upon this, but there's a few different parts of the zoning process. We have our planning department, and that's headed by Emily Foltz, who is our city planner. And they certainly do a lot within that department, but one of their primary functions is enforcing our current zoning laws and proposing changes to our current zoning code. And then there's the Plan Commission, and we are a citizen board. We volunteer our time. We don't have any approval power. We don't have any legislative authority. We're more of an advisory board. And we run meetings. Part of our purpose is to gather citizen input. and ultimately anything that goes through us, so ordinance changes, changes to our zoning map, PUDs, they ultimately make their way to city council, and city council has the legislative authority to approve or not approve any of those things. Lastly is the comprehensive plan. I think I mentioned this earlier, but the comprehensive plan is a document that is developed about every 10 years. It really depends on how the direction of the city has changed in that time. You can certainly have one for longer than 10 years, but it's basically where we want to go as a city over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So we are going to start developing a new comprehensive plan within the next couple of years. Emily Foltz is kind of starting the groundwork to get that kicked off. And every time we consider a new ordinance, we consider a change to our zoning map, we really are looking back to the comprehensive plan to inform us on what the direction of the city is. All right, so I just quickly went over the basics of zoning. That might have been a refresher for some of you. Hopefully you're able to learn something from that. Now I want to talk about just a couple ways that zoning can impact affordability. Now zoning has the ability to impact a lot of different facets of our life, but the affordability of homes is certainly one of them. So on the screen right now, I have on the left a single family home, and on the right I have a multi-family, what I'm calling middle housing. And that's a term that a lot of people use. That's not my term. But these are like garden apartments right here. You have a retrofit home, like a fourplex in this pane right here. And this is kind of a rhetorical question, but which one of these is the more affordable option? Certainly units on this right side really fit the mold of affordability. And affordability can look like a lot of different things, but generally units or cities that have units such as this are better suited. They have a more diverse collection of housing stock. So they're better suited to achieve some level of affordability. Whereas municipalities or neighborhoods that only zone for this, large lots, large homes as a requirement, are certainly less affordable. And sometimes that's by design. I mentioned before how sometimes zoning can be discriminatory. Zoning can be used as a weapon of discrimination. So let me move on. This is a great diagram. It's from a book by Daniel Paralek. It's called Missing Middle Housing. It's very technical. So if you want to geek out on like the technical aspects of zoning, it's a great read, but I wouldn't recommend it for, a book club. So, outside of large metros, you see a lot of detached single family homes, and you see a lot of, larger apartment complexes. You don't see a lot of these style of homes. And certainly we have, there's some examples around town, but we miss a lot of this. We do not have a lot of duplexes or courtyard apartments or townhomes. Sure, there are some, but not a lot. You see these more so in neighborhoods like in Chicago or St. Louis. And really that's been really the impact that zoning has. We do have multifamily areas of Edwardsville, but usually those are filled with larger style units as developers try to maximize their profit. So let me move on. Let me go back to our zoning district. So I mentioned before that we are primarily filled with single family residential, and it's even more single family than this map shows, as I mentioned before, with the different rezoning that's happened. One thing that we have done Edwardsville that I do not agree with is that back in the 90s, we grew our minimum lot size to 7,500. And when we think about affordability and how zoning impacts that, a lot of it comes back to density. That's really what we're getting at. As you reserve more and more land for fewer and fewer homes, that obviously will drive up the cost of housing. You're artificially driving up the price of land, and density has a positive correlation with affordability. So I mentioned that our minimum lot size right now is 7,500. If you go into our older neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are walkable, that have a lot of character, neighborhoods, west of downtown, north of downtown, LeClaire, between Schwartz and St. Louis Street, the vast majority of these lots do not meet that requirement. They are not 7,500 feet. So we developed as a city in our early days in such a way that we had lots that are between 4,000 and 6,500 square feet. And in the 90s, we determined that that style of development was not suitable for Edwardsville anymore, that we needed to have larger lot sizes. And we're not unique. That's something that a lot of places have done. And whether or not it is intentional or unintentional, functionally, it does act as discriminatory zoning. It limits who can afford to live in these places. It also impacts walkability. It impacts a lot of things. But land is a finite resource. Obviously, we have other land out here that you could build on, but building a house out here is not really affordable. You need to be close to town, close to food, groceries and public transportation. So this is where we need to have that that little bit higher density than what we allow. And I'll say that zoning is not a silver bullet. If we adjust some of these zoning laws, it's not going to automatically make Edwardsville more affordable, but it certainly stands as a barrier. It certainly can prevent affordable housing from occurring. Another thing that has been in the news quite a bit are parking minimums. So Edwardsville requires 2 off-street parking spaces per residential unit. And this just decreases achievable density. Now I'm getting back to that density theme again. But if you are in in one of our established neighborhoods and you wanted to put up a 4-flat, let's say you have a lot that allows that, you have to also accommodate 8 vehicles off street in order to make that work. And that's really difficult to achieve unless you have a very large lot. So this is another check that prevents density. And if you look around town, you see on-street parking in most of our neighborhoods. There's this stigma to off-street parking. There are pros and cons to it, but it does have a traffic calming effect. It promotes, if you don't require so much off-street parking, it promotes walkability. In having more parking surfaces, the more off-street parking you require leads to more runoff. So there's environmental implications to this. So there's a lot of things that go along with parking minimums, but certainly as they artificially decrease the density that you can build upon, it directly impacts affordability. And sometimes it doesn't really even make sense. So there are those new apartments on 157. I showed a picture earlier for Whispering Heights. Now that is a PUD, so we can change the rules for that PUD, but they sell studio apartments or rent out studio apartments as part of that development. And so that is 1 unit. And so that requires 2 spaces. Now, studio apartments are generally rented to single people. And they are That development is on a bus route. It's walkable downtown, and yet we in our city code require 2 spaces per unit in that development. So sometimes it really, doesn't even make a whole lot of sense. And I already talked about the walkability. This doesn't really apply to Edwardsville as much, but parking minimums we see in larger cities like St. Louis, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and it really starts to kill downtowns. We saw these parking minimums come into effect in the 60s as the suburbs started to grow and the cities needed to accommodate people driving into work. And so you used to have, a lot more buildings in a place like downtown St. Louis. And these buildings were leveled to be replaced with garages and surface parking because the minimums required it. But if you walk around downtown St. Louis now, a lot of these parking lots are empty. A lot of these parking garages are empty. And it's because these places that used to be so great were emptied out to create parking lots. You used to be able to go block to block to block and have something new and different and have different restaurants and businesses. Now there's big holes that we place in the middle of these, once more thriving places. So I'll move on. I've talked enough about parking minimums. So there are solutions, and they're pretty straightforward. Parking minimums are problematic, and we can reduce or eliminate them. That's something that the city has started to look at. And basically, if you eliminate parking, it's not going to eliminate parking lots. It's just going to allow the market to dictate how much parking we need. So we have an example in Burlington, Vermont. They have already reduced their parking minimums, and right now they're currently considering eliminating them altogether. And they're not unique in that. A lot of places are starting to do that. Decreasing minimum lot sizes. That's certainly something that I would love to see within the city of Edwardsville. I currently live on a non-conforming lot. My house is built on a lot that's too small. It could not be built today, but it's low maintenance. This is what I was looking for. And I believe that there are people out there looking for, smaller lots like this. And we couldn't allow some middle housing in our R1 neighborhoods. So Minneapolis eliminated single family zoning in 2019. They were the first major city to completely do away with it. And California, the state, eliminated it in this year. And so, there's been some misconceptions about what this means. This does not mean that you can't build a single family home. It just means that we are no longer zoning for it in those places. So what would that look like in Edwardsville? Certainly we don't want to be putting up large apartment complexes in a place like LeClaire. But we could start small. We could allow duplexes by right in those areas, or maybe 3 units. That's certainly not going to kill the character or the feel of some of these great neighborhoods that we have. So this is the last slide. I mentioned before whether or not zoning was discriminatory or racist. There are a lot of articles that are floating around that are scrutinizing zoning with good reason. But my take on this is that zoning is just a political tool. And for a long history in this country, the people in power were wealthy elites, typically white. And so they had an interest in maintaining the status quo. The people who are in power don't like to see things change. And so they wanted to keep neighborhoods, they wanted to keep the character of their neighborhoods, even if that meant not welcoming other people into those neighborhoods. So that's my presentation. I mentioned I'd save some time for questions at the end. I'd just like to thank everyone for giving me your time. And I really did enjoy myself. So thank you. Carol, I see you talking, but I think you're muted.
Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think this is a time for questions. I do have, maybe it's more a comment. You would comment on South Kansas. There's that apartment building. It's a new apartment building. It's a mixed use building, and it's very industrial looking, and it doesn't fit in with the bungalows that are on that section of the street. And it seems to me that it also will eventually eliminate those bungalows, which seem to be, at least in my perception, less expensive housing. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Every time I go by that industrial looking building, I feel irritated.
Yeah, it certainly definitely looks very different from the surrounding buildings. That one, I was not on Plan Commission when that originally was approved. I believe it was, well, actually, I don't know if that was a PUD. I'd have to look into the approval process for that one. It might have just been inside the B1 district and been permitted. But I can tell you that South Kansas Street, especially between that development and what street is that? The street where the old Alberices was, basically that 2-block stretch of residential.
Linden in Kansas?
Ended.
Linden.
That's right. Yeah. The city, the residents of that block have been very vocal. They love that area, and there are certain aldermen who have been fighting to keep that area residential and prevent encroaching. They are very close to downtown there, so they're kind of getting surrounded on all sides by mixed use districts. Some of that is zoned B1. Some of those neighborhoods are. That one example I showed earlier, that PUD, that's right along that block. So it is a very hotly contested area of town that people have a lot of opinions on. I believe S.J. Morrison is the alderman. I think that's Ward 4. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But he has been a staunch defender of maintaining that residential feel. I'd be curious to know what his take on those apartments are. I do like the concept, but I agree that the appearance is a very stark difference. The rest of the block.
I agree with that. It's a stark difference. I also actually love it. I hate to say it, but I do. Because I think it was an empty lot it went in on, wasn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah. So I'm all for infill that doesn't try to mimic something that we no longer can afford to build because the wood's too expensive, but that's just me.
Well, I wish that they had made some effort to make it blend in a bit better than it does. But as you say, that's me.
Right. I understand that it would be very jarring. It is. It does jar me awake every time I see it. It does. I can't believe they put it there, actually, but I do like it there.
And I believe that was a fund construction. I could be wrong on that one, but that typically is, this is another Met fund construction, and he does like that modern look. This one is not as industrial as that building, but has a much more modern look to it.
It has a real stacked look. It doesn't look organic to where it is. It looks like it was stacked there.
Yeah,
it looks like shipping containers.
Yeah.
Oh.
Would you
Well,
please?
I really like the appearance of it myself in many ways, but it will just kind of, it could blend in a little better, I think, probably.
Would you please discuss preserving green space within residential development and our developers being allowed to buy their way out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have, I don't have the percentages memorized. It'd probably take me a minute to look them up, but I think it's somewhere around 30% where they need to conserve 30% green space. And certainly you have seen developers buy out. They do have an option to pay instead of preserving that green space. And I have a few different thoughts on it. One of the great things about Edwardsville is how green it is. You know, you drive around, there's so many mature trees and green spaces, and that's one of the great things about Edwardsville. But I think it is appropriate, especially where you're trying to develop some more dense and walkable areas. So I don't have a problem with it when it's downtown. You know, I don't really see the need of preserving a lot of green space when that's just not the environment of downtown. But as you get out further out, I certainly think that we don't need to be developing so dense that we don't reserve any space, any green space. I think there's always room for that.
Okay. This is,
Why should they be able to buy their way out of it? That's what I don't understand.
That's a great question. And so what I'm told is that that buyout goes to our park fund. So it goes to, you know, developing green space elsewhere. But I don't follow the money as it, you know, gets put into the general fund. So I'm not sure how true that actually is. But I think that's the intent, is that even if they buy out, it improves green space elsewhere.
Yeah, my guess would be it was a compromise of some kind.
I think that the rate should be a little bit higher. Sometimes when I see what the buyout rate is, it doesn't feel like it's large enough.
I have a question about the planned unit developments.
Yeah.
When I got my planning degree that last century, planned unit developments were basically you were allowed increased density in some spaces, but you left a lot of green space, a lot of common space. The PUDs that I'm seeing seem to be basically mixed use. There's especially the Park Trace one, because it has so much commercial and it's not that much different than a mixed use with apartments above the buildings. But it seems like there's no common open space. Has that just gone out of the change through the years, and that PUDs become whatever a developer wants because he can't meet the requirements? It just seems like they're just using that as a title to get away from being able to comply.
Yeah, and really that's pretty much what it is. So it's really a way to be more flexible when our zoning code is fairly rigid.
Yeah.
So by nature it is them getting around some of our zoning law. And it's legal so that because we're in effect spot zoning. We're creating a new zoning law for that property, and certainly that's why they have become fairly controversial, because certain people can't get variances on their property to build a garage, but then they see a developer break 3 ordinances on a planned unit development, and so a lot of people don't agree with it. I don't remember there ever being a specific green space requirement for PUDs, and there could have been, but I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, well, when we had I retired working from the Air Force, and we would allow certain densities off the end of our runways. Well, actually no residential, but if they did a planned unit development using the old cluster concept, then you could increase the density off in one area as long as you left the open space sort of towards the end of the runway. So if a plane went down, it wouldn't hit the houses, it hit the open space. But in Texas, we ended up with half-acre size lots, and they were calling it a PUD. And it's like it distributed the homes clear across the area where the planes could hit. So the concept has changed from when it was first introduced, I think, to what it is now. And then doesn't Edwardsville have any kind of architectural compatibility? We would at least allow a blending of something that, I'm sorry that I watch the TV shows where they're taking the stacked shipping containers, putting them on end and building out of them, which is a good reuse of something like that. But there seems to be no architectural compatibility requirement at all for a unified, like at least a blended look.
In terms of like the architectural character, we do have a like a downtown, how is it, what it's worded? I'm searching for the word.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I was thinking more of
Development
the
code.
fringe residential when you
Yeah.
have neighborhoods.
We have some things that guide architecture. We have, like I mentioned earlier, we have a minimum requirement for brick on the front face of the building, which this development on the screen does not meet. So that was one of the variances of this PUD. But we do not have, and I think we have a glass coverage, so we have a certain amount of area for windows. But in terms of like architectural quality, in terms of design for our residential areas, I don't think we quite have that. It's more limited to a few different ordinances. And one other point you made that was interesting was that the mixed use component. So one thing that was true in Edwardsville is that if you wanted to be mixed use, it had to be a PUD for a long time. And now that has changed, but we had quite a few people at our last meeting thinking that it had to be mixed use in order to be a PUD. And so the first one's true, the opposite is not true. It does not have to be mixed use in order to be a PUD. And I think that there's probably different requirements for PUDs in different places. So what was allowed in a PUD in Texas might be different than Illinois. It's probably specific to individual zoning codes.
Yeah, it used to be primarily limited. Well, people did it to residential. It was a way to increase your density residential, but still keep the green space and give space for people to play, because the whole thing with zoning was light and keeping incompatible development away from each other so that you didn't have slaughterhouses next to residential houses. And it seems like, I mean, that's what the whole Euclidean thing was that whole, well, part of it was a separation so that you didn't get the offal down there in your drinking water. So there were legitimate purposes for zoning, and there still are legitimate purposes. Yeah, I think it's the chasing of the almighty dollar by the developers that have weakened that a little bit, but that's,
Yep. No, I agree with a lot of what you're saying.
So who decides what goes into changing or making changes in the comprehensive plan? You said Emily was starting on that process. Who is involved in that?
So that process is primarily driven by our planning department at the city and the comprehensive plan. And we have a comprehensive plan subcommittee that will start meeting to talk through kind of overarching themes and deciding on a third party to work with. Because nowadays, there's a lot that goes into them. Usually we have an agreement with a vendor who does a lot of the work with us. And ultimately, there'll be workshops, there'll be a lot of community engagement, but ultimately it is recommended for approval by Plan Commission and then goes to City Council, and they are the ones that put the stamp of approval on it.
Well, I certainly hope you have a loud voice in that process.
Thank you. Yeah.
If I can break in here a minute, there are two people who have their hands raised, and I'm not sure that we're not that technically savvy here. So please just jump in if you have a question.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. Well, we've become much more aware of environmental issues in the last few years, and original zoning, I don't think, had a lot of that consideration. Is that something that is likely to be considered more? Space for trees, transferring transportation possibilities, ability, et cetera.
Yeah, that's something that I could talk about Edwardsville as an example, but if I'm looking at the national trends, you're seeing much more focus on developing and encouraging developing around public transportation nodes. If you went back 20 years ago and you rode the MetroLink, every stop would have a parking lot. So you'd have people parking, driving to the train, parking, and then getting on it, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of a light rail transportation network. So there's that moving in that direction to try to alleviate some miles driven. Walkability, I think I've said a few times tonight, that's certainly a very hot topic. It's a buzzword in the planning community, but it's true that planners and developers really do want to build a more walkable, they want to build more walkable communities. So there's certainly that aspect of it. In terms of, environmental green space, we do have our green space requirements. I think there's other things that we could do better in Edwardsville. One thing is our native trees. We have a list of trees that you can put into a subdivision when you're developing it. I think there's like 5 or 6. And really that list was chosen by developers for their aestheticness and how easy they are to maintain. So, you look in a lot of our old neighborhoods, you have oaks, you have maples, elms. No one's planting an oak tree in a new development because they don't want the acorns. Well, that's not a very environmentally forward-thinking approach. So there's certainly there's steps moving in a positive direction. There's still room to grow, though.
I have a question, and I wonder what strategies communities use to encourage builders to build more affordable housing.
That's a great question. So one thing that, from a zoning perspective, there is one thing that's known as what's the term? Sorry, it's escaping me right now. Essentially, you can grant bonuses to developers. So if and this is similar to a PUD, if a developer wants to put more or build a larger building than they're permitted to, or have more units in a building than they're allowed to, you can grant them bonuses if they reserve some of those units for lower income or more affordable. So really, the only thing from a zoning perspective that I'm familiar with is to encourage that is to provide bonuses to them, to provide them some incentive to do that. Otherwise, they need tax tax refunds, things like that, which is a world that I'm not super familiar with, but hopefully that answered your question.
Do you think Edwardsville is looking at strategies of those kinds to encourage more housing for low income people within the city?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, because we put out an RFQ, which is a request for qualification. And when I say we, I mean the city of Edwardsville. Put out an RFQ for vendors to conduct an affordability study for the city. And we received 10 applicants at the end of October. And I'm on the ad hoc committee to select a firm to conduct that affordability study. And we're meeting tomorrow to talk through the 10 applicants and schedule interviews with a handful of them to move forward. So that's the next step. We'll be having an affordability study. It'll be a full housing analysis, a full housing needs analysis, and then the second part is an affordability study. And so that should kick off early next year, hopefully wrap sometime in the summer summer. It'll be a long and involved process. So community engagement. There'll be analysis of our market and our housing stock, and then ideally, what I would like to see is some actionable items come from that, from the affordable housing plan. I want to see, what are the concrete steps we can do as a community, and that might be, housing bonuses for developers to encourage more affordable developments. It could be other changes to our zoning code that I talked about. But there's certainly a lot of things that go into what makes a community affordable.
How are we defining affordable? Or, we can say affordable, and that means something that's not $400,000 versus low income. So is there levels of affordability? Because like you said, low income housing versus something that's more affordable than what's typically built in Edwardsville. And then what about all the impact fees? I just had a conversation today that said, you bought a lot for, $80,000, you might have $100,000 of impact fees in Edwardsville for the school and all the costs that a person building a home would have to incur before they even started building the home.
Yeah. And so before I unpack all that, those impact fees are definitely something that is a barrier to building, affordable housing. And that would be an example of a bonus that the city could grant. That'd be a financial bonus, not a zoning bonus. But, if you're building an affordable housing, we could waive the impact fees. That's something that, could possibly be done. But when I say affordable housing, there's a HUD definition, and that's 30% of your income. If you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, then it's not affordable to you. And so, it's a sliding scale. What's the median income of Edwardsville? Can that average person afford to live here? What about the people who are making $10 to $15 an hour in our service industry? Most of them can't afford to live here. They're driving in from other communities. So that we, as part of my work with the Edwardsville Community Housing Alliance, which John is a member of, which John's the founder of, actually, we did some analysis on the city employees, because that's public information. And we found that, about half the city cannot afford the average price of a home in Edwardsville. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't afford a home in Edwardsville. That just means that the average price of a home in Edwardsville was not affordable to half of the city staff. So I don't have a discrete number for you. It's definitely a sliding scale.
This is Carol June. I'm interested like in pocket neighborhoods. And when you put pocket neighborhoods where you're building the homes really close together, and they're designed, situated to protect the homeowner's privacy and stuff. I don't know that they're necessarily, though, cost less unless you can allow them to be small. Unless you like do 1,000 square feet, or make them smaller, they're still going to cost a lot, for the homeowner to. It just depends. You can make them cost a lot or not. But I came in late, so maybe you discussed that earlier.
No, you're absolutely right. So this pocket neighborhood,
as infill, right? As it is infill.
Yep. Yeah. So these ones, they're going to be 640 square feet on the main floor, but then they're going to be over 1,000 square feet for these homes. And I don't remember if Matt had estimated a price for what he thinks these are going to be, but there was a similar one that moved forward on East Union, and those homes are going to be going for about 240 plus. And that's before, materials have been increasing over the past few months. So that might actually be, a low number. It could be probably up to the 300s. So yeah, it's certainly not affordable for a lot of people.
So what if we go down? Now you have the minimum. I saw you said minimum lot size. Did I miss a minimum house size?
So yeah, our minimum lot size is 7,500.
No, house size. House size.
Yes. Yep.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to caveat that real quick. I'll get to the house size, but our lot size, I forgot to mention this. We wound up having to go back after we put that 7,500 square feet minimum and have a small lot overlay in our downtown area in the surrounding neighborhoods, because we effectively disallowed infill development. So now in some neighborhoods, that minimum lot size is actually 5,000. But to get to your question, we do not have a minimum house size in terms of square footage, but we do have a minimum house footprint. So the house has to be at least 750 square feet. 750 has to be 750 square feet on the first floor. So it could be a 750 square foot home. It could be 3 stories and be, over 2,100 feet.
But you could put just a 750 square foot home.
Yep.
And build like maybe 10 of them in an acre, or 8, however many on an acre. If you made if you made that pocket neighborhood where they do put them that close together, and then you have the open space in the middle, I guess that's what this plan does, I'm not sure. But it seems like, those could be more affordable that way. I mean, especially for like, older, single people, older women or men, or,
That brings up something else. What about the accessibility of these houses? They talk about these small houses for retired people, but a 2-story house with a basement is not good for that purpose. It's for young people.
Yeah, I think you're all making great points. I would love to see some pocket communities that are 750 or even 650, 700. If you're doing it as a PUD, you can bend some of those rules to make them, and they might not be affordable to everyone, but they'd certainly be much more affordable than some of the new developments we're seeing on the east side of town, like Edwardsville. Some infill with smaller homes would be something that I would love to see. But yeah, if you're having that target demographic of an aging population, you certainly wouldn't want to build something like this.
No. It doesn't even have to be aging. When you have a community like that and you have a single mother with children, you can have intergenerational people, in that neighborhood, and they can help each other out. I mean, there's a really good social concept to that, that allows people to, maybe buy a home that they couldn't afford otherwise. But
yeah, and this, that's part of the concept of the pocket neighborhood, is that you have a courtyard in the middle. It's meant to spur, neighborly connections. That's the positive spin on it. Some people have a cynical view that they're just trying to pack in as many homes as they can on one lot. So there's, everyone has their view on it. I happen to like them.
Well, something else when you're talking about affordability, what kind of requirements do they have to meet as far as environmentally friendly? What kind of requirements are there for making homes very energy efficient? That's what I'm getting at. How energy efficient are they? Because it's not just the cost of the initial building, it's the cost of heating and air conditioning and all that afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something that we really haven't really touched upon at all, is the energy efficiency of homes like this. And then that's definitely a hard thing to measure. Electricity is more expensive than heating your home with gas, but gas is also fossil fuel. But then where's your electricity coming from? There's a whole host of things that that's kind of a can of worms. But I agree. Anything. Maybe that should be something that we look at when we're considering these plans, is what the energy uses of them are and how we can make them more green.
Any restrictions regarding solar panels or anything like that when it comes to building? And are we incorporating any kind of adaptability and resilience into it? Maybe it's more of a building code than a zoning. I don't know how the town's dealing with that.
I'm not aware of any restrictions on solar panels, and I don't know if it's a federal or state law. I think there is I don't think you're allowed to restrict solar panels to a certain point. I think I just heard.
Your state doesn't allow any restrictions on solar. Doesn't allow cities or subdivisions to put any kind of restrictions like that.
Gotcha. Thanks, Susan. I appreciate that. I knew there was some restriction or rule out there for that, but I didn't know if it was state or not.
One thing is, it would be helpful if at least when they built these buildings, they made them put in some of the building with the idea that solar could be added later, because it's much less expensive to add it from the beginning than it is later.
Yep, I agree. And with this particular development, you got flat roofs, you got a lot of exposure to the southern skies. So this would be a great development to put solar panels on.
I think if you, when you're talking about limiting parking, I think that kind of has to go along with your transportation system, doesn't it? Because I know, like, when my daughters were at U of I in Champaign, and they had to pay really high off street, they had to get like permits to park on the street. It cost quite a bit, like now that's when you were having like co-house, like you have a big house and maybe you have 5 or 6 people living in it, and you have no, maybe 1 or 2 spots with that house. So then you park on the street, but then you have to pay high fees for that. So I guess public transportation would encourage people not to drive, instead of paying those fees. But
yeah, I think it would require a sea change, and what it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. Do you start discouraging automotive use to really start to encourage more people to use public transportation, or do you need to build up the public transportation first? Sometimes if you eliminate parking, what comes is there's certainly going to be less parking, and sometimes fees come along with that where you have to pay to park. And I would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's inconvenient, sometimes it's a hassle when it's you paying for it. But we've for a long time in this country subsidized automobile use and subsidized parking. And I don't think it's the worst thing in the world if I say that, but that also gets into affordability if you have to pay $200 a month for parking. So it's definitely a complex issue.
What would help is if people that have 2 and 3 car garages would quit buying so much stuff and having their garages stuffed so full that they have to park on the street or in the anyway. I mean, I see that a lot.
Yep.
Speaking of parking, when I look at this diagram of the PUD, it strikes me that the parking area is pretty much, it looks like at least as much square footage as the actual houses. And I would say that's true, or it's greater than the area of the buildings for most of the mixed use larger things, Whispering Heights and all that. And I'm wondering, is there any incentive or any incentive at all for building permeable parking so that groundwater can run through instead of off?
That is a great question. And the city recently passed, and I forget what we called it, but it's basically an environmental plan recently about, starting to encourage more permeable pavement, using more native plants. And none of that is codified as law yet. It's just a plan that.
Mike, cool cities are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Well,
yeah.
John, do you remember what the plan was called that they passed?
I don't. I just know that the cool cities has been trying to a similar plan of that go past for a long, long time. I think that's what we're talking about. I
Yeah,
don't know the name of
and the
it.
city council did give it a stamp of approval, but right now it's just directional. It's just,
Right.
here's what we want to start doing.
Right.
And so they actually took part of that plan and codified it recently, and that was any new city development has to have so many native plants that go along with it. But there's other aspects of that plan that we have not instituted yet. So some of that is permeable pavement. That's something that hopefully we can incorporate into the comprehensive plan and get into other developments.
I would say that's even, I'm a real advocate of native plants, but I think that is, if you're talking about how to get a better return immediately for what you're putting in, permeable parking would do it. When you look at cities that have had massive flooding problems like Houston, and I know they're in a much different situation than we are, but the development with all the water runoff and no plan for permeable anything or water offsets is what's causing their problems. So permeable parking would be a massive improvement immediately, especially since we're right off of a floodplain.
Yeah, and part of our city is in a floodplain.
Yeah.
And if you drive around town, in a heavy rain event, there are parts of our town that are a couple feet underwater.
And every new
that's an
development
exaggeration, but
affects this. Every new development affects this a whole lot.
Yep.
And guys, please mute yourselves if you're not speaking. Sorry.
And it's particularly true when we have an aging storm sewer system like we do in Edwardsville.
And that's why I was asking about the adaptability and resilience in terms of all the changing climate and the rain. But also you talked about walkability, and we have to deal with, there's no grocery stores downtown. In fact, I was just thinking, other than Walgreens, you can't live downtown. You have to get in your car. Well, there's some Leclerc could walk to certain ones, but there's no other incentives to get things you need for everyday life closer to where people live. I mean, other than the mixed use, I guess.
Yeah, I think that, I live west of downtown, and, I can't walk to buy groceries, but I do ride my bike to Market Basket. So there are some options, but to your point, it certainly could be a lot better. In terms of incentivizing movement, I'm not really an expert on that. There's probably ways we could do that. But I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure how we would incentivize, grocery stores to come into downtown.
Well, along with that thought is, what about jobs? How many of the people, walkability means that you're living within walking distance of where you work also. So how many people come into Edwardsville for their jobs, or go out of Edwardsville for their jobs, where walkability will help with grocery shopping and stuff, but you're not going to be walking to where you work.
Yeah, walkability is definitely a difficult thing to achieve. And I would say that, it doesn't require never getting in a car. It just requires cutting down some of your car usage. And any time you walk to a restaurant or walk to go grab a gallon of milk, that's more walkable than doing all of your trips in a car. So I think that adding the mixed use into our corridors, anytime we can encourage more ridership on MCT, that's all going to lead to better walkability. But it's certainly not something that we're going to be able to achieve overnight. And we're always going to be in somewhat of a car-centric spot where we're at. But yeah, I guess my point is, as many car trips as we can eliminate, I think there's certainly room for growth there.
Are there any other questions? I can only see part of the screen. Okay. Well, hearing no questions, I'd like to thank Mike been a really interesting evening, and thank you so much for being with us. So,
Well,
um,
Carol, thank you
I'd
for
like
inviting
to
me.
remi-
I really appreciate all your time.
And I'd like to remind the board members who are in attendance not to Zoom away when the meeting concludes, that we need to discuss our December meeting. So, thank you, Mike.
Thanks, everyone.